Britain recently decarbonized its beer, setting off massive social unease that led to rapid government intervention to reopen one of the UK's fertilizer plants, without which there was no industrial source of carbon dioxide for carbonizing beer, among other things. Beer crisis averted, temporarily. What's going on with the world energy situation right now? Skyrocketing heating prices in Europe are bringing growing anger. Even wealthy Sweden is promising subsidies to help pay heating bills. Electricity prices are skyrocketing, and blackouts are an ever-present threat. Countless factories are shut down, including fertilizer plants around the world, which is driving food prices up, with the worst yet to come. The world is experiencing the biggest energy crisis in decades, but it has nothing to do with the scarcity of energy. It is entirely caused by ill-informed, destructive energy policies that have shrunk investment in low-cost, reliable energy and supercharged investment in more expensive, less reliable energy sources. Why? Today's mainstream narrative, at least among well-off folks in rich countries, which dominate political power, goes something like this. The world's countries are united in battle against an ever-growing climate crisis. Only greedy, denying retrogrades stand in the way of a booming economic rebirth as the world system is transitioned to cleaner, greener, and cheaper energy. The energy transition is moving faster than we thought and is simply unstoppable. Only a fool would deny that. But it is an urgent, deadly race against time as the ravages of climate change are everywhere, wreaking havoc, most destructively among the poor and disadvantaged. No climate action is too drastic or too rapid in the battle to save humanity from destruction. Such is the narrative endlessly repeated by the media, politicians, activists, and even many in the ESG movement. Our schools are indoctrinating our kids with this narrative. It is even infused in movies and TV shows. There's only one problem. None of it is true. In fact, in every major point, the opposite is far closer to the truth. Let me elaborate. The 1992 Kyoto Accords launched the energy transition movement. 30 years later, trillions in subsidies, countless government mandates have yielded what? Fossil fuels have gone from supplying 87% of world energy in 1992 all the way down to 83%. Only a 4% decline in market share over the last 30 years. And that was the low-hanging fruit in the electricity sector in rich countries. Even that few percent change has caused a huge surge in electricity prices and declines in grid reliability. The UK and California have been at the vanguard, and the result is that most industry has left. They consume the same goods now, but they import them from elsewhere. This is leading to growing discontent at the resulting impoverishment. I personally don't care where energy comes from, as long as it is reliable, affordable, clean, and most importantly, betters human lives. As a kid, I went to MIT specifically to work on fusion energy. I worked on solar energy while a graduate student in electrical engineering at UC Berkeley. After that, I worked on next generation geothermal energy for years, and I am again today. The energy transition isn't failing for lack of effort. It is failing because energy is hard. Wind and solar today provide only 2 to 3% of global energy needs, and almost all of that in the electricity sector, which in total represents only 20% of global energy. You wouldn't know this because electricity and renewables dominate the energy dialogue. Today's energy dialogue ignores the big four materials that form the backbone of the modern world: steel, cement, plastics, and fertilizer. Without these building blocks, all highly dependent on fossil fuels, there simply is no modern world. In fact, today, oil and gas alone supply nearly 70% of US primary energy, a record high market share. What about the climate crisis? The rise of fossil fuels over the last century and a half have enabled a doubling of human life expectancy and a plummeting in the rate of poverty. The plummeting in the rate of humans living in dire poverty, humans living on less than $2 a day, has gone from 90% of humanity to less than 10%. Of course, this has come with costs and trade-offs. Atmospheric CO2 levels have grown by 50%, from little less than 0.03% to a little more than 0.04%. Carbon dioxide, along with methane and other gases, most notably water vapor, absorb infrared radiation, and they contribute to global warming. The Earth has warmed about 1 degree C over the last century, 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and at today's rate of warming, they'll probably warm by another degree C by around the end of this century. Is this a crisis? The most strident argument, we are told, is the frightening rise of extreme weather. Last year saw the lowest number of hurricanes ever recorded in the 40-year satellite record. Have you heard that? The year before had a large number of total hurricanes, but the total accumulated cyclonic energy, basically a metric of hurricane intensity, was on the low end of what we've seen. In fact, despite all the alarmist hype and fear-mongering, there has been no meaningful trend in global extreme weather events across hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, etc. These are the facts as reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But you likely haven't heard that before either. However, there has indeed been a very significant trend in by far the most important fact about extreme weather events: deaths. Global deaths from extreme weather events have dropped by well over 90% in the last century, a century in which the global population has more than tripled. This is fantastic. The decline in deaths from extreme weather is due to increased wealth and access to modern energy that allows advanced warnings for storms, stronger homes and buildings, and vastly increased mobility and rescue efforts. Almost all of today's remaining deaths from extreme weather are in poorer countries that still lack abundant access to modern energy. Even though a child born today has perhaps the lowest risk ever of death from extreme weather, today children have an extremely high fear and anxiety. 20% of children report having nightmares about climate change. This shameful campaign to terrify children is among the worst impacts of today's false and dishonest narrative. Perhaps the very worst impact, however, is the total disregard for those fighting desperately to emerge from energy poverty, which is nearly synonymous with poverty. Today, fully 1/3 of humanity, 2.5 billion people, lack access to clean cooking fuels and reliable electricity. This truly is a crisis. The World Health Organization estimates 2 to 3 million premature deaths every year from the indoor air pollution that arises from burning wood, dung, and agricultural waste for cooking. Simple propane cook stoves and fuel canisters can save millions of lives every year. There are millions of additional premature, preventable deaths from malnutrition, lack of access to clean water and healthcare, and basic education. Why don't you hear about this? You likely did hear how the US government joined 20 other wealthy nations at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow and proudly announced the cessation of any future lending for fossil fuel projects in the developing world. The 2.5 billion folks dreaming of a clean propane cook stove are surely not proud of such cruel and ignorant rich world virtue signaling. Climate change is not a grave threat to the world's poor, but the world's climate policies are. My company, Liberty Energy, this year is launching partnerships in Africa with local businesses to help spread clean cooking stoves and fuels to families striving to live longer, healthier, more opportunity-rich lives that we all enjoy. The same third of humanity without clean cooking fuels also lacks access to reliable electricity. Over 600 million lack any access to electricity. How do we compare this dire energy poverty challenge with climate change? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also does extensive work on the overall impact of climate change on human well-being. Yale economist William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for his work in climate economics. The estimates of climate change induced reductions in per capita human income range from less than 1% to a few percent by the end of this century. You heard me correctly. Even in the case of accelerated warming, the best estimates are only a 2 to 5% reduction in per capita income by the end of this century. That's losing 1 or 2 years of economic growth in the next 80 years. Stack that against millions of preventable annual deaths today. Let's tackle this human crisis now. Climate change is indeed a global energy challenge, but it is slow moving and modest compared to energy access. Continued technology advancements will enable the world to gain both abundant energy access and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Today, the United States has the lowest per person greenhouse gas emissions in my lifetime. This decline has been driven predominantly by low-cost shale gas, displacing coal as the U.S.'s dominant source of electricity. Nuclear energy is the world's largest source of very low carbon intensity electricity and could grow enormously in a world that becomes more sober and thoughtful about energy. Natural gas and nuclear are by far the two largest tools we have today to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. Curiously, they are both unpopular among climate activists. One thing we know for sure, driving up energy prices, destabilizing our electricity grid, and denying energy access to the least fortunate is both immoral and entirely ineffective in decarbonization. Energy poverty is not just a poor country problem. Over 10% of Americans have received a utility disconnection notice in the last year. A larger percentage report keeping their homes at unsafe temperatures to afford their energy bills, while also paying for life's other necessities. California, a state blessed with too many abundances to count, now has the highest adjusted poverty rate in the nation, according to the US Census Bureau. Lower income Californians live disproportionately inland, where the winters are colder and the summers much hotter than the swank coastal areas with the Mediterranean climate. This drives home energy bills up. Combine this with California's highly elevated gasoline prices, and you make life hard for low-income folks. Even worse is that California's expensive and unreliable energy policies have driven out the energy-intensive industries that provide so many high-paying blue-collar jobs. Texas is guilty too. Texas's poorly designed utility market, structured in order to encourage renewables, led to hundreds of deaths during the Uri cold spell. No one would pay the same price for an Uber that showed up whenever convenient for the driver and dropped you off wherever he wanted. But that is what Texas does with electricity, paying the same price for electricity that balances the grid as they do for unreliable, unpredictable electricity sources. This is nuts. Let your emotions drive your outfit selection, your restaurant choice, and who your friends are. But the global energy system is far too critical to human health, prosperity, and well-being to be driven by political and emotional whims. We are gravely failing humanity today. Last year, I wrote a company ESG report called Bettering Human Lives that discusses these issues in more depth. We desperately need more sobriety around energy, climate, and poverty. As my friend Robert Bryce says, energy realism equals energy humanism. Thank you.